Hello brothers and sisters of the Order, I am Templar, and welcome back, and today I will be talking to you all about the top 10 Swords of Antiquity from least to greatest. And now, in doing so, this will be of my own judgment upon them, and pretty much of my own feel, and pretty much of how I held them myself. In fact, pretty much we're going to go down the row and list of the top 10 of them. Now, as I stated, this will be of my own type of judgment per se, pretty much of the types of weapons that I've held to myself, mainly in reenactments, and have held first-hand experience of the real ones in comparison of these said weapons. So, enough of this, how about we get right to it and actually show you what I mean of how great these weapons are and why they are like this. Shall we? Alright, at number 10 we actually have the Egyptian KHOPESH. Now, why is the KHOPESH at number 10? I hear you already. Templar, it's a great sword, it looks badass, and pretty much it's a really cool weapon and I love Egypt. Yeah, just because of that alone, I'm pretty much going to get right involved into this. The KHOPESH is a good weapon, especially due to the fact it does actually act like an axe to the opponent. In other words, it's light as a sword, but yet its striking component is, how should we say, just like that. It's mostly meant for cutting use only. You cannot do a thrust. Now, you can actually do what they call a hooking design, of which you can actually hook the back end of the said KHOPESH on a said shield. In doing so, the weapon could effectively be a shield dismounting type weapon. However, there is a big problem about this weapon, as I stated. The weapon is only meant for said cutting. If you try doing thrusting, it doesn't work out so well. Now, don't get me wrong, the KHOPESH is a really cool weapon. Problem is though, as I stated, it's meant for cutting only, and in the process, you only got a single edge weapon. The single bladed weapon doesn't work actually in historical manuscript, and as well, it's even been stated to have been a horrible weapon by the time standards, and it was the reason why it was replaced with other weapons later on in history. Up next, we got the Mekhera. Now, forgive me if I mispronounce that in any type of way, but this type of sword is a very famous Greek type of sword, of which was actually labeled to be a very impressive type of weapon in history, of which actually had what you might call a downward shaped guard. Now, this is kind of odd, but in doing so, this was actually to stop the hand from going off and into the blade, in which actually, surprisingly enough, it worked very well in history books. However, the weapon does have a massive problem. Due to its iron quality design, it was actually stated to have been a less optional type of weapon. So we get that type of form, and of which, due to its design, it was mostly meant for thrusting only. And pretty much this type of weapon was actually stated to have been mentioned by Homer as a great weapon, but mainly more than just a big giant pointing knife, of which he stated the weapon is perfect, but yet it has a massive flaw, of which it evolved from a poor lack of quality iron, and of which mainly was nothing more than a big giant toothpick. Now, that actually makes us think about it for some reasons. Well, for one, sometimes there are even ones designed that have a single edge, however, there are some that have a double-edged blade. But most of the time, the ones we know about are the double-edged, and including the single-edged blade, but most of the time, the double-edged blade that's mostly meant for thrusting was actually even used during the time of the Trojan War, and was even stated to have been a very effective weapon. However, it was stated to have been a very ineffective one at that, which it had no form of cutting at all, only for thrusting, especially during this time and period, when pretty much everyone was wearing bronze armor, or including a type of lighter armor. So this type of sword would have probably gone through lighter equipped soldiers, not a guy equipped in bronze. Up next we have the HALLSTATSWORD, or as it's also known as the Gunglingen sword. Now, as it reaches number 8, this is a Celtic type of weapon, and of which is the one I really do love. This type of weapon was stated to have been a single-handed type of weapon used for effective type of combat, mainly for cutting use mostly, and of which it even stated to have had a Mexican-headed pommel on the very bottom to actually distribute weight from the sword, making it a perfect cutting weapon. However, it had a poor quality of thrusting, making it a very ineffective on the battlefield. And the first time it was first manufactured was in the Bronze Age, and even into the Iron Age. the weapon was said to have been fully constructed enough to actually cut through a human body, and even if a person was actually wearing said armor like cotton or bronze, they could even feel the weapon underneath the armor. Now, we can actually understand this of how dangerous the weapon could have been, and as well, just imagine of how dangerous it could have been, especially if it did actually manage to thrust. Now, even though you couldn't thrust with a weapon, it's actually stated that if you did thrust with it, it would technically feel as though, like getting punched with a, well, I want to say with a blunted object. Now, that's saying something, even though the tip of the blade was actually sharpened, however, not to a thrusting point, making it kind of ineffective for thrusting, but better for cutting, as I stated. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a pretty impressive weapon by far. However, trying to actually understand of how great a weapon this was in history books is kind of understandable. But it's actually stated by many historians that the weapon might have actually been best used as not as an infantry weapon, but as a cavalry weapon, seeing as though it was perfect for cavalry use for cutting. So we can see how dangerous this weapon actually is. Up at number 7 we have NAUE the Second Sword. This is another type of Greek sword in history, of which is a very impressive one at that. In fact, these type of swords are regarded as mainly another design from the Mikahera, of which in history books we do actually see that they nearly look identical. However, it's actually stated the NAUE the Second Sword was actually stated to have been one of the most famous, mainly because it could actually be a lot easier to cut and thrust with, which would later on evolve into the Greek XIPHOS. However, the Greek XIPHOS was slightly different compared to this. How so? Well, in doing so, this sword doesn't have a said guard. In fact, the pommel is actually all that weight distributed down in order to make the blade lighter. And a surprising matter of fact, the weapon actually can especially cut and thrust, especially easy. However, the weapon was stated to have been only used in a slight amount of time, and might have only been used by pretty much the noblest of warriors, such as Achilles, Agamemnon, Hector, and such. In fact, we do see these type of weapons being used in history books before the Battle of Thermopylae, for example. However, they were technically sometimes even used even after which, during the time of the said Peloponnesian War. So we could see why, even though Sparta and Athens might have had the same weapon, they might have actually only been killing themselves with the same cheap quality weapon. At number 6 we have the Spartan short sword. Now, why is the Spartan short sword at this area? Well, its reasons at number 6 is actually because of its military use and the discipline in the battlefield. In fact, now, if y'all don't understand why I'm making this list like this, it's actually because of the following. I had to think about the warrior they're going up against, I had to think about the soldier that's using it, and in the process, how were they using it? Well, it actually stated the Spartans actually used this short sword, especially if they lost their said weapon, mainly their main weapon being the spear. And in doing so, as soon as they lost the spear, they would go for the short sword, and in the process, stab at the said exposed ranks. And in doing so, if you take a look at the Spartan hoplite, he's technically a makeshift tank at the time. And in doing so, he can easily thrust his own sword deep into the said Persian immortal, or including even Athenian, with little ease, because this weapon is right behind him, and plus it's shorter than a gladius. It's technically like getting stabbed by a Randale dagger, only pretty much a flatter version of it. Now, this is actually a very scary part in history books, because the Spartan short sword was such a great and dangerous weapon. It did actually get stuck in the mindset of many warriors, and in which it was stated it was not meant for cutting, but for thrusting only. Which, yeah, is a big disappointment, really. Now I hear you already, but Templar, why did you put this one at number 6 then? Well, that's the thing. It's actually an impressive weapon by far. However, the way it's supposed to be used is for thrusting only, not for cutting use. In fact, if you're technically being a Spartan warrior, you don't want to cut with a short-ass weapon. At number 5, we got the Gladius. Now, why the Gladius? Well, this is actually one of my, well, I want to say one of my favorite weapons of the antiquity, but here's the thing. I'm pretty much using it as a joint group, because the term gladius is as a Roman version for sword, and the Romans copied the gladius from the Celts of Iberia. So the Celt Iberians have their own version in this. So yeah, you can see why I'm putting them in this. Now, the Romans had different designs in the early years, from the original Pompey to the Maximus, or including any others, or including the Gladius Hispaniensis, of which it was the original model. In fact, the Celts manufactured their Celtic Gladius from a different design. In fact, it looked like a said leaf. In fact, if we were to take a look at Bronze Age swords, they actually had a leaf-shaped blade. The Celts manufactured their gladius into a form of a said iron version, in which was perfect for both cutting and thrusting. And the very dangerous part is, it was more dangerous than a Roman gladius. However, the Romans actually could not actually manufacture the said weapon, so they had to manufacture it in their own form. So yeah, you can see why this did not work out so well for Rome. But now, the gladius does have a very good and best option in it. Why? Well, the weapon was perfect for formation type fighting, and as well perfect for one-on-one battle use, especially if you're going to use a sword and buckler combo. Now, it's even stated that the weapon was perfect mainly because if you do a thrust into a said exposed ribcage, you're pretty much going to kill the guy. However, in shield wall formation, the weapon was not a perfect weapon. In fact, just thrusting alone did not work. Now I hear you already, but Templar, couldn't you cut with this weapon? Yes, but it was not meant to be used as such. In fact, it's actually stated that in doing so, if you were to cut with the gladius, the only thing you're going to do is accidentally hurt yourself or get yourself and your teammates killed, because you actually had to fight as a unison formation in the Roman legionnaires. This is not the Celtic type of gladius, of which was used as both cutting and thrusting. But still, this is why I put these two in the conjoined group, because they're both the same design. For number 4, we have the broadsword. Now, the broadsword of antiquity is a lot different than what we think of the broadsword of medieval age Europe. In fact, the broadsword actually evolves from the ancient Celtic swords from the Hallstatt culture, and evolves into the known type of sword that we think of. In fact, I actually have my own Celtic broadsword as well, if you all remember that, or if you all haven't seen it, I will leave a link down below in the description for it. Now, as well, these swords are incredibly great in battlefield use. In fact, the most known type of weapon that we think about, the Celtic broadsword, evolves over time. In fact, later on, the Romans actually copy off of it and incredibly create the Delios. Now, what's a Delios? A Delios is an Punic War era of Sparta. In other words, this was a pre-Sparta weapon before the Romans kicked it out for the gladius and then brought the Sparta back in the battlefield, mainly because of the Celts of Gaul. Now, I hear you already. Templar, how does that work exactly? Well, it's like this. The Celts created the longsword. The Romans saw this when they got attacked in Rome, especially by the Celtic warlord Brennus, and as well, they developed the Delios, which is a pretty perfect thrusting weapon during the Punic War, and as well during both Punic Wars, in fact. However, the weapon had a slight drawback. Due to its design, it was a slight problem, because there was hardly any weight design on the back end, while the Celts had a uniform weight design distributed all across the sword. Now, the Sparta was a copy off of that, of which they manufactured it to its design. Now, why is the Celtic Sparta a little more badass? Well, it's kind of obvious, really. The Celtic design sword is actually a very unique design, and of which it actually has a reinforcement design guard. In other words, if you take a look at the Celtic hilt, for example, on the sword of the Celtic broadswords, you actually see a very cool design. Whether it's in wood, silver, or including in jewels or gold or brass or bronze, it's actually stated that it would have a human body design. In doing so, this actually can make it effectively perfect on the battlefield. In doing so, the weapon can actually distribute a massive amount of weight into the handle, or in the process, all throughout the sword. And in fact, the sword was actually stated to have been light enough and strong enough to actually be used as a cutting weapon and a thrusting weapon at that. And in fact, it's even stated that Romans and Greeks, and including many other cultures, that actually hired the Celts for their cavalry use with the broadsword, in the process on the battlefield were such effective with the weapon, it was such a dangerous part of weaponry tool to them. Now, don't get me wrong, it is a dangerous weapon, but that's how it went. At number 3, we have the Greek XIPHOS. Now, why is the Greek XIPHOS at number 3? Well, this one is kind of explains itself. In fact, out of ancient type of timeline, this is actually one of the only swords in history books that is stated during the time of the Bronze Age, or including during the time of the early Iron Age, that actually had a type of casted hilt, or in the process, sometimes even an iron hilt, mixed in with a guard and such. In doing so, the entire sword was pretty much sometimes made of metal, or in the process, there would actually be a wooden handle. Now, in doing so, the sword actually had a leaf-shaped blade, which kind of nearly looks identical to the Celtic gladius. However, this sword is extremely different. How so? Well, this is the biggest example. There is a guard in which there is a heavy weighted pommel, making the sword extremely heavy in the grip area, of which was making it perfect for both thrusting and cutting. Now, the weapon is an effective type of weapon, though we don't know which one copied off of which, whether it be the Celts or the Greeks that might have copied off of who when it comes to the leaf-shaped blade. However, we do know in history books that this weapon was used by multiple groups during the time of the history of warfare. For example, it stated that the Themistocles, or including Leonidas and his 300, or 1,000, depending on how many there were at the Battle of Thermopylae, depending on how many there were last, would have actually used the said Greek XIPHOS. And as well, it's even stated that even the Persians might have even used this said weapons, mainly because it was an effective fighting tool. Now, this weapon was used throughout history pretty much through, I want to say, from the time before the Peloponnesian Wars up until we reach said during the time of the fall of the last Greek kingdom to Rome. Now, in fact, the Romans did actually use these said weapons. However, they later on got rid of them and for a different type of weapon, mainly to be a lot useful for their manufacturing process. In other words, technically the Romans just got a little lazy with manufacturing a good weapon. Now, the weapon was effective on the battlefield, yes. However, it had a slight bit of a problem, and that was it was a little too pommel heavy. Now, don't get me wrong, you can actually pretty much knock someone out with this using the pommel itself. However, the pommel did have a big problem. Due to all that weight down in the pommel area, it still had a big problem, as always. Because so much weight was in one area alone, guess what? It's going to make it come a little hard for you to swing a sword if you can't technically control it as much. However, the Greeks designed the sword to actually fight against that, well, said weight. But that's the problem. Now, the weapon was extremely perfect for thrusting and cutting use, as I stated. However, not so great when it came to the said armor. For example, this weapon would be perfect, say, going up against lightly armored troops like a Persian warrior. However, if it was to, say, go up against a fellow Greek clad in bronze or iron plate or something, it's actually stated that they would have not actually worked as well. In fact, they would have had to cut into the gaps in the armor in order to try and kill the said opponent. However, we could see how this might not have worked most of the time. At number 2, we have the DACIAN FALX. Now, what's a DACIAN FALX, ladies and gentlemen? Well, I'm glad you might ask. A DACIAN FALX is a type of Celtic weapon, which is presently from the region of modern-day Romania. Now, this is a Celtic weapon. Don't get me started of how many people don't understand the difference between the history department in this, of understanding of people who are of Celtic origins. But anyways, the FALX is an incredible weapon by far. This is a single-edged weapon. Now, the FALX is technically a sometimes used in a two-handed or one-handed use weapon. And the thing is, this weapon was perfect enough on the battlefield. And the scary part is, these weapons kind of made the Romans fear the weapon itself so much that they actually had to reinforce their helmets. During the time of the Dacian Wars, it's stated that Decebalus actually used these said type FALXes in order to actually split open the Roman skulls right through their helmets. In fact, the weapons and the process went through the shields and including even the Roman helmets, as I stated. However, this actually caused the Romans to reinforce the top end of their shields, and including reinforce their helmets with a type of triangular bar. In other words, a crossbar that stopped the weapon from going down. Now, this did work, yes, but the thing is, the reason this weapon only gets at number 9 is because this is mostly a cutting type weapon. Mostly not used for thrusting. You can thrust with the said weapon, however, it's a lot different than what you think. Now, as you all see in the images, it looks like a, well, like a scythe. However, this is no scythe. Now, these weapons are effective on the battlefield, and in fact, many reenactors, as I stated, do actually prove a point of how dangerous these weapons were. Especially, some of them were big enough that you can actually, well, literally probably cut a person in half. Now, I've only been hit by a reenactment weapon like this, not the real one. So, yeah, since the reenactment weapon is only blunt and we were only using half our strength on it, you can see why I didn't want to get hit by this. Now, don't get me wrong, these weapons are effective on the battlefield, however, they had a slight drawback, as I stated, unison form. Now, why unison? It's kind of like this. Imagine, say, for example, I'm going to go up on the battlefield and fight, say, a Roman legionnaire, while I got my Dacian army using only cutting type weapons. In doing so, the weapons still did actually terrify the Romans, especially in guerrilla warfare tactics. However, up front, it did not work out so well. And in doing so, the weapon was kind of useless. So, no offense to any of my Celtic brethren in Dacia, but you see my point. Now, the weapon was a perfect weapon in history books, and in fact, the FALX was, how should I put this, a type of pole weapon also, so I guess this is a mixture weapon, I can put it at that. So, yeah, we see where this is going with that. But still, this weapon is by far a perfect example, and in fact, its design was meant to kill through the armor. Well, ladies and gentlemen, number 1 is none other than my personal favorite, the Celtic FALCTA. Now, why the FALCTA? I hear you already. Templar, I've heard you say the FALCTA is a great weapon, yes, but you said that it has to have pros and cons, yes? Well, yes, but the thing is, this weapon actually can thrust and it can cut effectively. Now, why is this at number 1 and pretty much before it's actually number 1? Well, before the FALX, kind of because of the fact this weapon actually cannot get stuck in shields. Now I hear you already. Templar, that's impossible. Well, you see that little umbrella-shaped handle on the very bottom? Here's the thing. That's actually meant to stop the sword from getting stuck in. In other words, as soon as you get this weapon tossed into the shield. In other words, think of like you're swinging the sword, and in the process, it gets launched right into the shield. Here's the thing, you just pull and it gets loose. And in fact, the weapon was perfect during the time of the Punic Wars against Rome. And in fact, this weapon was used by Carthage, the Celts, Rome, the Etruscans, the Greeks, Persia, Egypt. It was pretty much used by all the Mediterranean. And in fact, many Celts in Gaul actually use it as a sacrificial weapon in order to actually kill said bulls or something. Now, in fact, even Germanic Celts actually managed to copy off of it, however they used bog iron, which was a lot different type of, well, substance quality. Now, don't get me wrong, the FALCTA is a perfect weapon, but it does have a slight problem, the weight distribution. Why do I say that? Well, here's the thing. This weapon was perfect on the battlefield, yes, but the thing is, due to so much weight in the head, it's kind of like swinging an... It is a sword, yes. However, this weapon was so dangerous on the battlefield, it's stated that it's like getting hit by an axe. Now, not just any type of axe, like it's like getting hit by, like, say, like I want to say like somebody hitting you in the chest with holding a two-handed hatchet. Now, if y'all don't understand the distribution of cutting, here's the thing. If you were to actually take a regular axe and a hatchet would actually dig itself in a lot more than a regular battle axe, and which is kind of easy to understand, really. In fact, this weapon was so dangerous, in fact, it stated it was better than an axe. And in fact, you can thrust, you can cut, and the thing is, you cannot get the thing stuck in anything. In fact, the Romans feared this weapon so much that they actually had to reinforce their shields even more during the time of the Punic Wars. However, after this incident, they kind of decided to let go of the reinforcement, and when it came to the Dacian Wars, we could see what happens there. Now, don't get me wrong, this weapon is an effective weapon in the battlefield, and in fact, you can actually use this as a type of conjoined military use weapon. In other words, you can actually hide behind your shield and actually easily cut down. In fact, it's kind of what we see during the time of the Punic Wars, when it said the Romans are getting killed by the, well, Carthaginians. And in fact, the weapon was perfect, especially because it can cut the person underneath their armor. Not through the flesh, but through the bones and the muscle tissue. In other words, imagine this. You're technically wearing, say, chainmail or mail, whatever you all want to pronounce it as. I'm just putting this out here so that way y'all can understand my point. In doing so, this weapon was effective enough, it could actually break the body underneath the armor. In doing so, say I'm a Roman legionnaire, I'm wearing my Punic War helmet, I'm wearing mail with a mantle, and a gambit underneath that. Here's the thing. That weapon could easily break my skull in two, even if I'm wearing a helmet, and I'm even wearing a gambeson and a said armor, but in the process, this weapon can easily break my collarbone, especially if it hits my shoulder. And in fact, I actually have taken reenactment blows when I did Punic War reenactments. With a couple of my old buddies, we were just trying to prove a point. And in fact, this was a real one, this was not a reenactment one. We just wanted to prove a point, and I still have what you might call a torn wrist muscle right in my hand. Lucky for me, though, it's not as bad anymore as it once was, and because, now, here's the thing. If y'all don't understand what I'm saying, here's the thing. If you hold, say, a center body grip shield, like a tower shield, like the Romans used to use, like a Roman scutum, or including a Viking round shield, in doing so, if you use that center grip shield, what can happen is the FALCTA actually can break the wrist. In doing so, here's what we see. Romans are actually fighting, and in doing so, guess what happens? Here comes that FALCTA blow onto that shield. And in doing so, guess what happens? The Romans lost grip of his shield, he drops his shield, and in doing so, he is now slaughtered for the next blow. This weapon was perfect for both thrusting and cutting, and that's how it was used. In fact, this weapon was such an effective weapon in history books, it was even used by cavalry. And in fact, it may have been a short weapon, but due to this design, the forward curve that was designed forward was so effective that it actually combats against a saber even more effectively. Now, Deadliest Warrior tried to prove a point with Hannibal and Genghis Khan, however, they didn't do a very good statistics on the fact. In fact, the historical meaning behind these weapons is because this thing can break the body muscle underneath the armor. And that's saying something. It's like saying, well, as y'all can see with the design on the said head, we actually see that little curve on the very end. Here's the thing. Imagine getting stabbed by that. Not a very good feel, does it? In doing so, that weapon, in the process, your skin is technically absorbing onto it, and in the process, this actually adds a massive wound. Now, doing so, these weapons were not meant for thrusting, these things were mostly meant for cutting. However, on the battlefield, these are effective, especially on chariot warfare. In fact, the Egyptians did use them slightly in chariots, but not as much. Now, the only scary part about these weapons, as I stated, is when it comes to their cutting blow. Now, lucky for me, I only had it in my wrist. So, yeah, that's my point. I was effectively enough, didn't feel the rest of it throughout my arm. In fact, we actually did use a mannequin to prove our point with the said Roman armor, that of what they would have felt. However, the mannequin did not actually have, what I want to say, enough flesh. You know what I mean. It was technically made of this, well, like a porcelain doll. Now, in doing so, we actually observed the shoulder impact, and in doing so, the shoulder was technically just caved in. And here's the thing, if you were to understand this, and from my point of view, this is an effective weapon by far, and in doing so, this weapon was probably, well, best on the battlefield. Now, if any of y'all are pretty much planning on getting these for your kids or such, be my guest. In fact, these weapons are perfect for combat use. Now, if any of y'all understand of how much these weigh, here's the thing. The real ones are a lot heavier than the reenactment version, and the reenactment versions are extremely light for reasons. And in fact, these real working ones, especially one that I have a video on it. I will leave a link down below for y'all, and as well, I will even leave links of stores, both from here in the U.S. and including for overseas, for many of y'all who don't actually live here in the U.S., for any of y'all who actually want a FALCTA, or including who wants a KHOPESH or any type of these weapons. I will leave links to their said region, but pretty much I will leave to the site of the said website y'all want to buy it from. In doing so, y'all can actually buy it yourself. Now, anyways, as I stated, this weapon are effective on the battlefield. In fact, this is why I put these at the top 10 list. Now, be my guest and buy these all you want. Observe them from your shelves and such. In fact, I do know that one of my viewers actually did contact me today about actually wanting to buy his kid a Celtic sword. Well, I think I might have interested his courage of buying even more than a Celtic sword. Anyways, guys, this has been Templar. Hopefully you found this helpful. Let me know in the comments below if you all want me to talk anything more about history. And as well, guys, very soon I shall be covering Black History Month very soon. And then later on, Civil War History Month, and then Celtic Month. So, yeah, prepare yourselves for that. Anyways, guys, this has been Templar. Have a great day. Subscribe, like, and as well, also join our Facebook to actually be notified of our next upcoming videos. And as well, any type of things that might interest you. Anyways, guys, have a great day.